Hi, everyone, and welcome to this Facebook Live. This is a topic that is very close to my heart. I've spent the day, as you can see, I'm at a dive site today, and I've spent the day talking to some instructor and course director candidates about the importance of briefs and debriefs. So perfect timing to talk about this topic. So if you are interested in diver behavior, human factors, then I'm sure you've heard the name Gareth Locke come up time and time again. Gareth has carved out a great position as the go-to guy for human factors. So let me introduce you to Gareth. Are you there, Gareth?
I am indeed. Great to see you, Mark, and great to see you down at Vobster. It looks like a nice day down there.
It's not a bad day. Great day. The weather could have been a little bit better. Um, so I mentioned you're the go-to guy for human factors. But before we get on to that side of things, do you want to give us a little bit of a background? Who are you? What's your background? And what else have you done other than diving?
So I joined the Air Force in 1989, and I spent 25 years in as air crew on a Hercules multi-crew transport aircraft. I was a flight instructor in that environment, and I did a master's in aerospace systems, which is where my sort of real interest in human factors came. We were operating with human factors anyway, but it was this bit of, well, how do we take this further in terms of incidents and learning in the diving community? I couldn't believe that diving didn't have the same sort of processes involved, and that's where I started sort of time-wise to learn how to dive as well. And for the next number of years was involved in research and development, systems engineering. And then in 2012, I started a part-time self-funded PhD to look at the role of human factors in diving incidents. And it was a real challenge. That was where I started talking in the sort of dive shows and things like that, why human factors are important, how and why we make the mistakes we do, and really importantly, what we can do to try and prevent them from happening. Now, in 2004 is when I sort of really got back into diving. And since then, I ended up being GUE Tech 2 for advanced driving circuit and a JJ because I wanted to understand the sort of rebreather challenges that were there as well. So I've got about 800 dives to my name. I'm the Director for Risk Management for GUE, so I look at all the sort of quality control and the performance and standards of the instructors that are there. And in 2016, I formed the Human Diver, which was to formalize the sort of training programs that I was putting together. And since then, I've probably trained 350 plus people globally, literally from the West Coast of the States through Europe, Middle East, and out to Australia and New Zealand. I wrote a book last year, which has sold about 3,500 copies now, which tells a number of different stories about how people behave, interact, the mistakes they made, and take those stories apart in the context of human factors. And it's just really been growing since then. And yes, it's great considering we were discussing beforehand where I was in 2011 writing a white paper that said, this is how we should apply human factors to diving, and upsetting a whole bunch of people in the process. And actually now things have moved on, which is great. And it's brilliant to see instructors, organizations starting to pick this up and recognize it's not just common sense. Experience allows you to develop this. What we're talking about here is accelerating the learning process, so we don't have to learn from other people's mistakes, and importantly, not make those mistakes ourselves.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think it's interesting. There's especially in technical diving, accident analysis has always had a strong reputation, and I think in some ways we forgot a little bit about that. So I think it's really useful what you've been doing. Remind us, taking us back to our first principles. So the human factors area, it's a huge area, and anyone who's interested in it, I would definitely recommend Gareth's book. But today we want to focus specifically on briefings and debriefs. And as I mentioned earlier, I've just spent the day working with some instructors on exactly that topic. But I've just fallen into the trap. I've talked about instructors and doing briefings on training dives. But what's your view on what sort of dives require briefings? Is it just for training?
No, and I would say every dive requires a brief of some sort, because the goal here really is to make sure that everybody is on the same song sheet, or as we were discussing, in the same book to start with. We've got to understand what our roles are, what is it we're supposed to be doing, what the limits are, and there's a number of sort of topics that I've got for that. And ultimately, it's about creating this concept called a shared mental model. Instruction's easy because as an instructor, you're leading a team, and you've got to make sure that the lesson objectives are understood by the students, what is considered success, and making sure that all of the safety parameters and the risks are being managed proactively, rather than the assumptions, which is normal behavior. That's all right, they know what we're doing, so we'll just jump in and crack on and it's okay. That same assumption process happens in non-training dives, and what we need to do is clarify those assumptions and validate them before we get in the water, because then it's much harder to communicate, because you lose most of your vocabulary once you get below the surface.
So that's that's all very well, and I agree with all those concepts. But for those divers, instructors, or regular divers who are listening, who aren't as familiar with the terminology, how does that translate in the real world? What sort of problems do we see if we don't have a good briefing?
So the problems that we often can see in terms of incidents that are reported, and that's it's a huge topic in itself, is that we don't get a lot of the adverse events captured, those near misses or the close calls. But things like, what's the minimum gas that we have left at the end of the dive to ascend? Often we have this, well, be on the surface with 50 bar or 500 psi. But what does that mean when you're at the bottom? Is that, how do you know how much gas to ascend from, say, 30 meters or 100 feet? What is that limit? What is our maximum decompression limits? And that could be 0. Right, when you get time to surface, or whatever your no decompression limit is, I want you to let me know what it is. So we clarify, okay, we're going to have a 0 minimum deco dive. No deco limits. You're going to have something left on the clock. It could be about what happens when we enter a wreck or we approach a wreck. Because what we want to do is make it easy for people who are not necessarily confident to turn around and say, well, hang on, we didn't brief that we were going to enter this wreck. And I can turn around and say, stop, we're not going in. Because actually, if we haven't talked about this, as an inexperienced or an underconfident diver, where somebody's more experienced or instructor, and they go, right, we're just going to go in, and you sit there going, and off they go, it's really difficult. So it's about setting boundaries before we get in the water, to make sure that the dive goes as expected, and hopefully that expectation is how we planned it as well.
So how can we improve the process then? How can we make our briefings a little bit more effective? How can we cover off some of those points and avoid some of the problems that you've just been talking about?
So one of the first bits is, recognize that we're going to be operating together as a team. What we want to do is make sure that everybody is got the same idea before we get in the water. So having a structure to a brief allows people to know what's going to come next. So we can talk about the dive limits themselves. Are we talking about depth? Are we talking about, well, we need to talk about depth. We need to talk about endurance, talk about gas limits. Actually, what gas are you breathing? Because are we, the diving that I do, everybody dives standard gases. So we know that it's, and we although that saying that, we still cover it as part of the dive brief, that if I'm diving 32%, I know that the rest of the team is diving 32%. So our decompression will be within a minute or two of each other, as opposed to getting in the water and not necessarily knowing what gas is everybody else. So I might be diving 32%. I'm sitting there going, well, I've got loads of time left on my no deco limits, and you're on air, and you're racking this up, and I don't know this, and I'm the experienced diver. You're the inexperienced. Oh, Gareth knows what he's doing, so we're just going to carry on swimming. Oh, hang on a minute, my deco's no, that's right. We'll just keep on swimming. So, understand dive parameters, understand emergency protocols. Are we going to do, what's the lost buddy drills? What are we going to do on the dive itself? Who's going to send the SMB up, or who's going to lay line at the bottom? Who's going to lead the dive, so that we don't get to the bottom of the shot line and go, where are we going? So really it's about helping people, I'm going to say, almost visualize the dive before they get in the water, and create the environment right from the outset that says it is okay to ask questions. Because if you create an environment that is questioning at the briefing stage, then people are more likely to ask questions during the execution phase. But if you shut questions down during the brief, then don't be surprised when nobody asks any questions during the execution phase. And we end the dive and people go, well, why didn't you tell me about that? Oh, well, I didn't want to. So explain all the parameters, work out the contingencies, and check understanding.
Yeah, and I think, obviously there's a huge number of other topics around this, but I think the teamwork is absolutely critical. And I know there's probably a load of TDI instructors screaming at the screen at the moment that if you're doing a deco dive and you're on different gases, that's not a team. You're not acting as a team. So yeah, this has got to fit into the bigger picture, hasn't it?
Oh, definitely. And actually, it could be recreational diving as well. So I get the technical side. But I know, there's lots of people who dive non-standard gases within a team, and they go, well, that's right, we'll just manage our decompression amongst ourselves. And you're right, they're not necessarily, in their view, they're operating as a team, because they don't understand what a team is about. What we're trying to do is make sure that everybody is doing the same thing at the same time, so that we actually don't have to spend a lot of time thinking, what are they doing? What are they doing? We're trying to reduce that mental overhead.
Yeah, and I think terminology is a really big part of that, because my view again, if you're doing deco diving, that's not a recreational, that's not a sports dive. It is a recreational dive, but it's not sports diving. That's technical diving, and technical diving equals team diving. I think it's when people get into that grey area where it's a little bit of tech. It's a little bit of deco. That's, I think, when some of the issues tend to come up. I tend to see the more serious the dive, the more serious people take it. It's that bit in the middle that I think is what can catch a lot of people out. So this isn't something that is just aimed at the expedition divers. This is aimed at the ordinary divers who are just pushing their limits a little bit, or just gradually expanding their limits.
Definitely. And, from my experience in other domains where I work in high-risk industries, construction, power utilities, healthcare, what we find is that accidents occur as deviations from normal work, normal behaviors. They don't normally occur when you've got a special event. So an expedition dive where you spend a lot of time working out the contingencies, what the what ifs are, and planning it so that everybody knows what's going on, that's not normally where things go wrong. It's when we have that sort of comfort zone. And I often, people go, oh, complacency, that's what we're talking about. And I have a passion about this. When things go wrong, that automatic behavior we call complacency. When it goes well, we call it efficiency. And often we just sit there and go, well, they were complacent. Okay, so what did they normally do? Well, they normally did that. All right, so why didn't things go wrong then? Oh, because they were working on the same mental picture, the same mental model, the same expectations of what's going on. And then there's some little deviation means that they didn't spot it, and then the thing starts to snowball. And it's a particularly unforgiving environment underwater. If you're in the sort of 30-meter range and 100 feet and shallower, you have got a get out of jail card. As long as you don't have a decompression overhead, you can go up. But a lot of the time, unless you've got gills, you are really poorly placed when it comes to emergency situations.
Now, we mentioned, having been on the same page and using similar terminology. A lot of agencies do have a briefing acronym abbreviation. TDI uses START. I've come across SEEDS. There's a whole range of them. Do you think it's important that there is a briefing structure, or do you think it's important that everybody uses the same briefing structure?
Oh, well, there we go. There is definitely a need for a structure.
You weren't expecting the easy questions, were you?
Oh no, but I also know the politics that exists within the diving industry of no, we can't use that because that's somebody else's, and we've got to have our own little acronym because that sets us apart. And I've also heard of organizations approaching another one and saying, can we use your terminology, your acronym? But yes, but only if you credit us and say that this is our agent. Oh, come on, give it a break, So there is, from my view, there is a need definitely for a structure, and that structure is for two reasons. One is so that the speaker, the transmitter, the leader, whoever it is, knows the sequence of what should be covered next. And if you have something like START or SEEDS, or I teach United as a way of setting it up, or I dive with GUE Edge as the final check, is having a structure and understanding what sits in that letter, then actually we can cross-check each other. I know what I need to say, and that follows through. The other benefit is for the team members, the listeners, to go, okay, that's that. I know what the next thing is. So I'm not going to ask an inopportune, question. But also, I'm human. I'm fallible. I miss something. And you can go, Gareth, are we not going to cover the gas, the dive exposure? What's the dive time and what's the temperature like? Oh, sorry. Thanks. And so what we've got to do is, the first bit is, yes, a structure is needed. And it needs to be consistent within the team. And this is this bit about team diving. It doesn't matter to a certain extent what that structure is, as long as it's consistent and it is understood. And the same thing for gas limits, deco limits, depth, all of those. A team is operating to a consistent set of standards within that team. Now, from my background through GUE, we've taken that to the next level and said, actually, these are global standards. And so there are standard gases, there are standard decompression profiles, standard briefs, standard equipment. And the benefit of that is I don't have to think about what should be done. And it also means that if you've got some kit that's in the wrong place or it doesn't look right, I can spot it much more quickly and sit there going, is that wrong? Or is it just how you do it? And if we don't have a safe environment, which is the other key factor within a team, psychological safety, is this ability to say, Gareth, that isn't right. And unfortunately, with the egos that are running around the diving industry, that's really hard to do, to turn around to somebody and say, Mark, that doesn't look right to me. Can you explain why or how that's set up? Who are you to tell me about? And he's sitting there going, oh, come on, I'm just asking a curious question. What I'm not trying to do is judge you and say, that's wrong. My concern is it doesn't look right, and I don't know whether or not it's wrong or it's just how you do it. So creating that environment at the briefing stage that allows people to question challenges is really... So the bigger question is, do I think globally there should be a standard? Yes. And I think that's the same thing for rebreather checklist as well. Final jump dive, final pre-splash check. I think there should be a standard pre-dive splash check that is global, the same way as the World Health Organization did the same thing for the safe surgical checklists, and get rid of all of the agency meism and just say, look, we need to be looking out for each other. We're all fallible, and actually let's look at these, because the splash check or the final pre-dive check, the sort of 5 minutes to getting in the water, that should be consistent for every rebreather. It doesn't matter what manufacturer it is, that should be a standard.
Yeah, I mean, we've got a standard checklist for rebreathers that applies to every rebreather. It doesn't matter what the bells and whistles are, you can use that standard checklist. But I think, yeah, you're right, and it is a difficult position, because every agency wants to standardize it, but they want to standardize it on their own. So you can't not standardize it, but equally then by each agency standardizing it themselves, they then create non-standardization across the the industry. But I think it is something that we can solve. I've spent quite a lot of time recently working with other agencies on the ISO standards for rebreathers. So there is a template for it. So if there are any other agency representatives who want to work together to standardize some of these things, get in touch. We do want to work together. We don't want an abbreviation just for the sake of having it. So yeah, I think that's a really good topic to bring up.
Just actually as a notice, there's a great question from Tony. Actually, isn't this the logical extension of plan your dive and dive your plan? A little bit further up, and yes, you're right. But to me, the problem with that statement is that very rarely does the real world match what you expect to do. So there is this bit that says, let's look at the contingencies, the what ifs, so that actually everybody knows when the plan doesn't go to plan, what are we going to do? Because people are time poor, they're money poor. And if you get to the bottom of the dive and it's not quite what you were expecting, are you going to thumb the dive and ascend and then knock that dive on the head because now you haven't got enough gas to do it? Or are you going to say, right, here's the plan A and here's the plan B. If we get to executing plan C, well, we probably need to be ending the dive at that stage because we've now deviated a distance away from what we were managing our expectations. So I get frustrated when people go, plan your dive and dive your plan. You go, yeah, okay, that isn't what happens in the real world. We need to work around that.
Yeah, plan doesn't survive first contact with the enemy or the water.
Yes.
Yeah, great opportunity to put in a plug for a blog I wrote for Shearwater recently about exactly this, about planning in the real world. And planning the way that we actually do things, not the way that we imagined that we did them 20 years ago.
Definitely.
That's a great, great point
that I teach in the sort of high risk industries is this bit between work as imagined and work as done. And work as imagined is where it's all written down, the procedures and the guidelines and what we expect to happen. And then work as done is, this is the reality of the situation. It could be the weather is poor, it could be the visibility is poor, the current's picked up, it might be that some of your kit isn't working as you'd expect it to do. So what we've got to do then is adapt, and that provides a learning opportunity to recap after the dive, to make sure that we learn so that we can better ourselves for future dives, but also if we can create the culture that allows us to share those close calls, the near misses, total learning opportunities, to get those out there. And then people go, hang on a minute, I can build my knowledge from somebody else's operation, not just my own, because I'm never going to make all those mistakes myself. So why not learn from other people?
Absolutely. So yeah, great question, Tony. And if there's anybody else that's got any questions, please feel free to put the questions in the chat. We'll keep an eye on those, and when they come up, we'll put those up.
Benjamin's got a good one, because I think we might be moving on to the next topic. So Benjamin's, what suggestions would you have for those working on a dive boat as a guide and leading tourist and recreational dives? And the way that I would do this is, it's about setting yourself up as the leader of that dive. You are leading a team of other divers, and the best way to set that up to show that you care about them is you say, look, actually, everybody, we all make mistakes. I made a mistake this morning. And what I want to do is make sure that before we get in the water, we are set up for the best success possible. And what I want to do is go through the brief and the expectations. And by talking about a mistake you've made yourself vulnerable. You've now made yourself approachable. People are more likely to listen. And then you talk about what we're going to do, go through things, and then don't use closed questions at the end of the brief. It's too easy to say, did everybody understand that? And it is too easy for them to say yes, because we've got authority gradient. People don't want to look stupid in front of everybody else. So ask open questions. So Benjamin, we're on a dive, and I've just given you a brief. What I'd like you to do is describe in your own words what we're going to do when we get to the bottom of the shot line. What are you expecting to see, and which way are you going to go? Now, you can't answer that yes, no. Well, you can, but you look pretty stupid. And by asking them to put it in their own words, what you do now is testing their comprehension, as opposed to asking them, what are you going to do when you get to the bottom of the shot line? And if they just parrot back what you've just said, all you've done is tested their short-term memory as opposed to their comprehension. And look at people's body language. Are they engaged or not? Ask them some questions. And this is, leadership. It's about the stuff that Mark teaches in terms of instructors. It's the same thing. Instructors are leaders, guides are leaders. You have a team that you're interacting with, and you need to communicate and look for non-verbal communication is more obvious. And I think you posted something on your the learning group a couple of days ago about non-verbal communication. It's really hard to lie with non-verbal communication. And the way our brains are wired is, if I see a mismatch between your non-verbal communication and what you're saying, I will believe your non-verbal communication over your words, because it's really quite easy to lie verbally. It's really hard to lie non-verbally, unless you're a politician. So,
yeah, I teach my instructors that body language, non-verbal communication is the closest you can get to mind reading what your students are really thinking. It's a great point. So yeah, if anybody else has got any questions, please stick them in the chat. And I think yeah, Gareth, you're right. It's probably time to move on to the second bit now, the debrief side of things. So the dive's gone well. No one died. No major incidents. Do we need a debrief?
Yes. And there's a loaded question. There we go. So that's a closed question. That's a leading question too. So definitely. And often, and I know where you're coming from, because people go, well, nothing went wrong on the dive. What do we need to debrief? Because the perception of a debrief is, let's fix the things that went wrong. And you know, that is one of the bits, one of the valuable pieces of a debrief is understand what didn't go to plan. And the bit that most people then miss out is, how did it, why did it go wrong? What were the conditions that led to us not having the plan be executed as expected? Because it's easy to observe deviations and things going wrong. It takes a lot more to dig into why it didn't go to plan. Oh, well, I poor attention. Okay. You've got a fixed capacity when it comes to attention. Where was it pointing? I ran low on gas. Okay, why? Oh, because I wasn't paying attention. All right, but where was it pointing? Are you in a habit of checking every 5 minutes? Are you able to project into the future how long that dive, how long the next 5 minutes or what that consumption of gas is going to be? So there are always learning opportunities from a dive, even if nothing goes wrong.
Absolutely, yeah. Now, I think you've got a particular structure that you use for the debrief model. So can you talk through that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. And what I can do is just sort of put up some slides now. So can you just confirm that that's there, Mark? You got a thumbs up?
Yep, we can see that.
Brilliant. So, in terms of the debrief that you can have, this is one of the sort of slides from my teaching program. And what I talk about here is the different types there. We've got a technical skills debrief, and that's really what happens in a lot of the training environments where you're working with an instructor, you're trying to acquire some technical skills, and that could be operating a rebreather, it could be about how to be an instructor, it could be buoyancy, trim, propulsion, all sorts of those things. They come under the technical skills development. Each of the agencies has their own structure of what you should cover and how you cover it. Most importantly, from my view, is it's great, and I sort of touched on it just now, is you can observe things that aren't necessarily right. Importantly, you need to be able to understand how to fix them. So understand the corrections required. So there's the technical skills debrief, and that's really what happens in a lot of the training environment. Then we can talk about improving ourselves, and this works as instructors talking to students. Okay, at the end of the day or the end of the class, one thing I do well, one thing I can do less of, and one thing I can do more of. And that's just a one-to-one connection, and we can make sure that we understand what we are, how do we get better. And then we talk about the team learning, because a lot of what I teach is about high performance teams. How do you operate together as a team with the common consistent goals, and we get better because we're looking at performance-based goals. How do we improve? And so that structure follows the word debrief. And the D, which we have, is define the aims and goals of the dive, and did we achieve them? So that's the first bit. Now you sit there and go, oh, hang on a minute, did we have a goal on this dive? Now that could be as simple as, and I think every dive should have it, is everybody gets back on the surface having had a good time and they want to go diving again. That is, in sort of Star Trek terms, the prime directive. We want to make sure that that's it, because if people haven't had a good time, even if they haven't been injured, that this is a social activity, it's a sport, we want to have fun. So that's the first bit. And then did we achieve them? Simple yes, no, and then we can explore that a little bit further. Then define the length of the debrief, set the expectations. Right, this is going to be a quick 10-minute debrief, and what we're going to do, we're going to cover key aspects. So I know that actually, Gareth, you're rabbiting on. This is 20 minutes now, and we haven't got to the end of the debrief. You've lost it. So manage expectations. And the training that I deliver for a 45-minute mission that we use in the simulation program, we would look at somewhere between 45 minutes and an hour for a debrief. And people go, that's a really long time. And you go, but there's a lot of learning. We have a team of 4 people, and everybody needs to learn, and the structure we're talking about. So once people are engaged and they realize the learning has value, not just about fixing the broken things, about getting better, then actually that's how we should, the debrief adds value and people don't mind taking a little bit of time. The next bit is E, which is about setting an example for learning and vulnerability. Psychological safety is this shared belief within the team that it is okay to make a mistake, it is okay to put your hand up, to contribute, to challenge, that it's a little bit more than trust. It's trust within the team that says it is okay to say something that might be a bit wrong. And it is the leader's responsibility to create that environment. And the easiest way to do that is talk about something that didn't go to plan on a dive. And from an instructor's point of view, this applies in an instructional setup as well. And it could be that the instructor turns around and goes, my thing that I didn't get quite right in here was I was in the wrong place watching you do that gas share drill. That meant that I couldn't see exactly what was going on. And what we're trying to do is make ourselves approachable. We're trying to reduce this thing called authority gradient, where we reduce that tension that sits there between leaders and followers. People go, oh, well, they should just speak up. They should be brave. And you go, no, bravery is required, or courage is required when there is fear. What we're trying to do is get rid of that fear by being open. And that also has a secondary benefit, that if one of the students or the team members talks about a mistake they've made on the dive, and you have a go at them and you say, well, that was stupid, it was obvious that was going to happen, they can turn around and say, Gareth, you made a mistake on that dive too. Oh yeah, okay, sorry. So it has a dual value. It's about fundamentally, it's about setting the scene up to be safe. Then the B is about basics or background. It's pre-dive. It's pre-jumping off the back of the boat or getting in off the shore or entering the, getting in the water. It's all of the pre-execution. So we're talking about the planning, the equipment, the gas analysis, the logistics, the shot time, the sort of slack time, all of this stuff that says, what did we observe and what can we get better before we get in the water? Because there's a whole bunch of stuff that could be improved beforehand, and understand why those deviations occurred prior to getting in the water and how we will address them. And that could be, oh, we were rushed and, it meant that we didn't get our final pre-dive check done before we jumped off the back of the boat. You sit there and go, well, why were you rushed? Oh, because the skipper gave us that time and it wasn't quite right. All right, well, say to the skipper, can you give us a 15-minute warning instead of a 10-minute warning? Because what we want to be doing is be prepared, ready to go. So look at the conditions that led to the deviation, the error, or reinforce the good stuff. So that's the B. The next bit, which is where people spend loads of time focusing, and actually it's not that relevant when it comes to learning, is review of the timeline. Well, at 5 minutes we did this, and at 10 minutes we did that, and so on. And that doesn't necessarily help the learning. It gives you anchor points to pick up potential learning areas, but don't spend ages looking at this. I know that there are people who use video cameras for debrief. This is great as long as you jump to a point in the dive. Don't replay it sort of a speed of 1-to-1, because that's not how to run a debrief. Look at those critical milestones and understand, is there anything that's relevant that we need to pick up? And then the real learning happens. The leader runs this. So they covered D, E, and B, and R. Now we're going to talk about internal learning, me. What did I do well and why? What do I need to improve on and how? And then those are the two most important questions out of those are why and how. And I touched on earlier. Observations are easy. Understanding why something happened in the way it did is a bit harder. And then how do I improve it? Look at something that's concrete that you can improve. And then the leader would go around the rest of the team and say, okay, Mark, what did you do well and why? What do you need to improve on and how are you going to do it? Brittany, you're the same. And then we go on to the next bit is, okay, as a team, what did we do well and why? What do we need to improve on and how? And then the other team members do the same thing. And the goal here is that everybody will have a different view or a different perspective about what happened on that dive. What we're trying to do is get different views so that we can learn and improve for the next time round. And so we create that self-reflection, and it's quite hard to look at yourself and say, what did I do well? Because we often just miss that out. Let's look at specifics. And that's the other piece out of this, is look at specifics. Our team communications was good. Well, that doesn't help me improve because we know that communication's needed. What we're talking about is, actually, Mark, when we were swimming along on the side of the wreck, you were in the number 2 position, you're behind me, but you shined your torch on the wreck wall and I could see that, and you kept it in the right place. And when you moved it away, you brought it back relatively quickly. That worked. Let's carry on doing that. And so by focusing on a specific issue, now it's much easier to reinforce and redo in the future, as opposed to, yeah, light communications was good, Mark. All right, what was good about them so I can reinforce? And then the final piece is this debrief, the follow-up or file. You've just done a dive, you've briefed it, you've set the scene for success, and you're going to go and do something well. You go and do the dive, and you did stuff well, and there's some stuff that needs to be improved. Look to the future. Let's apply this. Often people talk about, oh yeah, well, we got some lessons learned. And I say, did you change anything? No. All you did was you identified some lessons. Now, it might be that you make a conscious decision to say, we're going to do that again because it worked. Okay, fine. We can call that a lessons identified. But if something didn't go to plan, it went wrong, and you haven't changed anything, that's just lessons identified. And so here, I can learn within the team, or we can learn within the team by sharing that information. But it would be brilliant if we could share that learning across the community. And there are a number of Facebook groups allow this to happen. Agencies and organizations have incident reports that allow that learning to happen, but it needs to be a real context-rich story. It needs to include how it made sense. If you broke the rules and things didn't go to plan, rules being a sort of a loose term here, it's about understanding how it made sense to do those things so that people can learn. So the recap, debrief, define the goals, set the parameters for the debrief itself in terms of time, create a psychologically safe environment by saying and talking about a mistake or something that happened to me as the leader. I set everything up. Talk about the background, pre-execution. How do we set the dive up for success, kit prep, timings, and things like that. The minor thing, and actually I'm going to change the debrief to be a little R at this stage, because whilst the review is what people like, when it comes to learning, it doesn't add much. And then the two learning pieces, internal and external learning, individual and team. And then the final bit is, how do we take this into the future? How do we learn? And if you want to get a copy of the guide that I use, it's free to download from that link there. Help yourself. And I know Jason is on here, one of my students, graduates, and it's changed the way that he teaches his classes and the learning that happens. And I've had a number of people come back to me and gone, it's a bit awkward to start with, but actually when it works, it's fantastic. And you get the real learning that goes on. So there we go. There's the model.
Excellent. Yeah, so I think, as you said, Jason's put up a comment about using that, and there's a couple of other really good questions I think in the chat that cover some of the areas I wanted to go into as well. So if we can bring up some of those. There was one from Richie. I think is a really
So how do you approach giving constructive criticism? That one. So how do you approach giving constructive criticism during a debrief to someone who may not be open to it? So the first bit is, would you like some feedback? If the answer is no, okay, that's it. You know, it ends. That bit about, I'm going to give you some feedback. Right, okay. That sets people immediately on the defensive. And actually, where I've talked about how do you set that up to increase the likelihood that they say yes, is you go, I'm just reflecting on that dive. And you know what? This didn't go quite so well for me. And these are the reasons that it didn't go. And I'm all for improving myself. So self-reflection is really important for me. Would you like some feedback on that dive? And you increase the chance of them saying yes, because you've made yourself vulnerable and fallible and expose your fallibility by saying, I'm not perfect. And nobody is, no matter how experienced they are. There's always an opportunity to learn. So it starts with your attitude about your development and feedback processes. Hopefully that helps, Richie.
And I think also, by the time it's the end of the dive and you've noticed that there's a problem and you want to give feedback, it's sort of too late, or not. It's not too late, but ideally you want to start earlier. So start the debrief. Start the briefing with linking to the debrief. So set the expectation right from the very beginning. If we're diving as a team, we're going to do a briefing. We're going to do a briefing. We're going to do the dive, and then we're going to do a debrief. And then there's no, I want to raise this because you messed up. It's a normal part. Making this a normal part of every dive, I think, is a big way to avoid some of those issues.
Definitely. And that's, the D of the United that I teach is determine the time and place of the debrief, set the expectations that we will have one. And it might be that actually one of the ways there, Richie, is you get them to run it and say, look, you observed this dive. And you can say, okay, so one thing that I did well, one thing I need to improve on, or one thing I need to do less of, and get them to provide you feedback straight away. Oops, there we go. Oh, you're muted, Mark.
Yep. So there's another question from Mark Rowe. Seen a few familiar names on the the chat this evening, which I think links into this as well.
So,
any thoughts on that?
yeah, I would go that says, okay, we've just done a dive, and actually set the scene up again, as Mark said. Look, at the end of this dive, there's going to be something where we can improve. Would you like to get better as a diver for free? Because I can provide you some information if you want at the end of the dive. Because you're paying me as a guide or as an instructor. I've got a lot of experience. I can help you get better for free at the end of the dive if you'd like some feedback. Are you up for that? And be positive about it. And if they turn around and go, no, I'm good enough. Okay, fine. You can still then say, look, I know you didn't say anything. I'm not going to provide any feedback for you, but this is feedback that I learned on that dive about myself. And it might sow a seed for the next time. It's hard, I get that. But as a community, we can start changing. And one of the first books that Mark recommended to me was called Join the Club by Tina Rosenberg, about how do you create change at the lower level when the higher levels have failed. And it's about community peer pressure. So if you're diving with other people from your dive center, Mark, actually debrief yourselves and talk about what you learned. And people go, oh, what's going on there? Oh, we're just talking about how we can get better on the next dive, because we know that, we didn't do everything perfect. There is something that we can change. And this is what we use as a structure. You can listen in if you want. And so now you go, oh, that sounds like a good idea. Can we talk about that? And that's the same as demonstrating in water technical skills. How do you stay flat in the water? How do you not go up and down all the time? How come so role model.
Yeah, I think, and that's a great point. It's about changing the attitude from a debrief being picking up all the things that went wrong to being learning. And I find that, a lot of people, they focus on the debrief too much on what went wrong. You did this wrong. You did this wrong. This failed, and they forget about the good stuff. And it's critical to emphasize the good stuff, because sometimes people do things right accidentally and they don't quite know why it was so good. Identifying those and making sure we do those things again is just as important.
Oh, too right. I think we're wired for that, picking the holes in things, and it's really hard to get yourself out of, well, that was wrong, and that was wrong, and that was wrong. Well, hang on a minute, what went well? And by having, in the same way we talked about a structured brief, by having a structured debrief, then we know what's going to be said, when it's going to be said, and we know that there is a positive part of that and an improving part of it. Oh, have we just lost Mark, Brittany? Okay, well, I can see you on the. That's because there's a time delay on the Facebook Live. So yeah, Mark's gone. So I can read questions if you want to type into the questions. Let's see as we scroll back up. So going back up to Katie Montemayor, along the same vein as Benjamin's question, how do you impress the importance of briefings to students? It's by my experience that they default to blindly following than learning and using briefing and how to implement it in their next practice. And actually, the way I would do this is get them to own the brief. So the first time you do it, in that context is you demonstrate. It's that sort of teach one, demo one, do one, is get them to own the briefing. And this is a learning experience. And where I talk about with sort of GUE instructors, try to encourage them when they do the instructor dive, the experience dives, is get them to run the briefing and the debrief at the end of the dive. We shouldn't be surprised that divers don't know how to debrief a dive if they've never been taught how to debrief a dive. So trying to put this into agency diver training development, it's already in the instructor development because they've got to debrief a training dive. What we want to do now is take the next step, is saying, okay, students, this is how we would do a fun dive debrief, and I'll demonstrate it. And on the next dive, I'd like you to run a learning debrief yourselves based on that. And I might add little bits, but I want you to own the debrief to get better.
So what I've learned from this, and the mistake I've made, is I've worked out that the close comments button is far too close to the close window button, and so we can always learn. We're not perfect. So are there any other questions that have come up?
Question from Daryl Adams. Briefings and debriefing pertaining to PSD are critical as a team. Thoughts on this arena? Yes, absolutely critical. And you've got an easier job because you're diving in a structured environment. You have a nominated dive supervisor, or you should do, and you can influence things a little bit more. The downside of it is my experience of the PSD community is it's very ego driven and creating a psychological there we go.
Unlike technical diving, with no egos in technical.
Your non-verbal language, you couldn't hide it. You went like that. So, so what we're trying to do here now is, for the leadership to say, look, I want you to speak up. I want you to question. I'm fallible. I've come up with a plan, but it may be rubbish. And that's part of the briefing process. And there's an item in mine is called test the plan, including go, no-go limits and points. Red team it, pick holes in it. But for people to create that environment to pick holes in the boss's plan, you've got to have created a safe environment. And some work that I did probably about 18 months ago with a guy in the States who was involved in a lot of PSD work. And he said, really difficult. People would just believe the boss because they're the boss. And you go, no, that they could be wrong. We've got to change attitudes to that. So hopefully that helps well. Great, Tony, thanks. Ryan, within our group of divers, it's become pretty normal for us to call each other out if something isn't quite right, or you say you've done good with that. Is it still worth us having a formal debrief? The answer is yes to that, because what you're potentially not doing is doing it as a team learning event. So you can pick holes in other people, and I know from being in a close team, there's a lot of banter goes. And, you can pick holes in people and joke about stuff. But do you actually reinforce the good stuff with specifics? And when you pick holes in people for potentially dropping your stage and it's hanging around, you go, oh, that wasn't good. Did you look into why that happened the way it did? Look at the conditions that were there. Why didn't it get picked up beforehand? Was the diver stressed in terms of putting stuff? Is there wasn't enough room? How would we prevent that from occurring the next time? So having a structure that helps you learn, not just a close-knit team going, duh, you shouldn't do that again. Having the structure certainly helps learning. And it's awkward to start with, definitely, because people go, I already know that. But actually, if we go in there and say, look, I make mistakes, let's use this as a learning opportunity. And then can we share that learning with other people? Because I can guarantee that the mistakes that one team makes will be the same as somebody else elsewhere. And that's my other piece about trying to create a just culture environment where people can talk about their mistakes without others throwing metaphorical rocks at them for being stupid. And that was obvious, when in fact, if it was obvious, somebody would have picked it up in real time at that stage. So any more questions? Because I think we've got a couple more minutes, and Mark might be back. Depends how good he gets onto the Wi-Fi at Bobster. Thanks, Steve. What suggestions would have those working? Yeah, so Benjamin covered that one. The stage had a mind of its own. I'm sure it did. It's an inanimate object. Right, I'm going to scroll all the way back up. About teams, definitely, Tony. There's more to it than just being on the same deco plan and on the same gases. It's one of the bits when I run team training for divers. and they realize that teamwork is way more than just getting in the water and diving together. Same ocean buddies. There's way more to it than that. As B will explain, instructors need to be able to take valid criticism. Many of the mistakes of students are down to the quality of the instruction. Instructors can also learn from their students or buddies. Totally. And one of the bits that I teach in the leadership and followership and teamwork sections is that instructors are leaders and students are followers. And instead of having a hierarchy, you revolve around a common purpose, and that for a training dive is learning. That is me as the instructor teaching you something so that you learn, but it is also my purpose to learn from you as an instructor, because I need to have some feedback. And we've got to reduce this authority gradient that allows students to challenge us and say, that isn't right. The difficulty is a lot of times students don't know what they don't know. And to a certain extent, instructors don't know what they don't know either, because they've been taught formulaic process. This is how you teach a class and how you teach somebody to dive. My cynical view is in a lot of cases, you are teaching somebody to pass a course. You are not necessarily teaching them to dive in the real world. And those are slightly different outcomes that we need to address. Oscar Chen, how would you deal with person not willing to learn? I would say, one of the challenges there, and I don't know where you are globally, is a cognitive bias. There could be some culture issues here, that in certain cultures, we don't like to be questioned. We don't like to be challenged. But I would ask the question, how would you deal with somebody not willing to learn? I'd ask the question, if you're in a training environment, what are they doing on your training course? If they are there, what are they paying you for? Are they paying you for certification, or are they paying you to learn? And again, those are two subtly different things. And the way we can do that is right at the start of the class, you can set the expectations. Or in fact, before they join the class, have a student interview and understand what their goals are, what looks like success for them in terms of this class. Is it about acquiring skills? Is it about acquiring an attitude or a mindset to get better? And then you can use that to shape the conversation when you get on the class and say, right, I'm going to give you some information to improve. That requires, me to be critical. There is a difference between being critical and criticizing, and make sure that it's about observable behaviors and not about the person. Again, subtleties that are on there. Fun dive customers. So not willing to learn proper navigation. Okay, so before we get in the water, let's talk about the importance of navigation. How often do you follow a GPS blindly with TomTom or Garmin or whatever, Google Maps? Okay, so is it always reliable? No. Okay, so when I teach in something that could be as a confrontational or that could be conflict, I pick a non-relevant environment. So in the context of diving, navigation, I would talk about surface navigation, in a car, in an aircraft. How important do you think it is that pilots know where they're going? How do they know where they're going to go? Well, they cross-check with a compass, and they put stuff in the flight management system, and they cross-check with each other. So pick a parallel, an analogy, talk about that in a non-confrontational bit, and then say, okay, so we're now going to move into the diving environment. Tell me why you think navigation might be important if we're going to go on a reef, or we're going to go on a wreck, or we're going to be in a cave or a cavern system, and get them to own the problem. And then you can say, right, now we've shown why it's so important. Let's talk about how we make navigation work. Hopefully that answered that one, Oscar. George, any other tips for a newer team to implement this kind of structure to dives, training dives, with a specific goal in mind? I would have a structure, and I will, in fact, if I share, can you share that one, please, Brittany? Start off with a structured brief. Make sure, and there's a subtle difference between a planning brief and a final dive brief. And so in this bit here, United is the planning brief. This is the bit that before you start getting kitted up, just talk about what you're going to do on the dive itself. What's the goal? Make sure that everybody understands what that goal is before we go any further, because it might be that other members have got different different ideas. Understand the objectives. Next bit, notify team of roles. Who's going to lead the dive? Who's going to put the SMB up? Who's going to, if everybody's running their own decompression, all of these things, what are we supposed to be doing? Do we have enough equipment to do what we need to do? Do we understand what the risks are? And the threats are things like, what if the current changes, the visibility changes, all of those things. Then pick holes in the plan, which is the test plan piece. Then look at the contingency plans. Establish, the what ifs. If we have a buddy separation, what are we going to do? If somebody goes into the wreck and it all gets silted out, what happens then? And then talk about determine the time and the place of the debrief. So set that up. That's the pre sort of planning brief, and then have your own final dive brief, which is GUE Edge or BWRAF or SEEDS or START, whatever it is. This is the final. Make sure that your dive equipment, which is life support equipment, will support your life when you get off the back of the boat or you jump off get in the shore or whatever. So there are two parts of the briefing piece. One is set people up for the dive, and the other piece is our life support system working properly? So back to myself now, Brittany. Hopefully that answered that one, George. Mark Owens, mental health is becoming a lot more prevalent today. Do you have any advice on how scuba diving can benefit mental health and how this should be considered? Yes, contact Dr. Laura Walton and visit her site, Scuba Psych. She has a wealth of knowledge on this topic, and that's her speciality. She's a clinical psychologist, and she's done a whole bunch of work in that. So scubapsych.com, psyche.com, or just Google Laura Walton, Scuba Psych, and make contact with her because she's got loads. Thanks, John. Not as big as yours, but I do have some grey, a bit old, elderly here. So any other questions? What do you think the most interesting question is when it comes to briefs and debriefs? So there's a slight delay here because I'm doing this, and then there's about a 5-10 second delay when the messages come through. So if there's a pause, it's because I'm waiting for any comments that are coming in. Well, if nobody puts a question in the next 30 seconds, I'm going to wrap it up and end this presentation. I must say thank you very much to TDI for inviting me along. As you can tell, I'm somewhat passionate about this. I must have been teaching it for the last 4 years and working on it for the last 9 years or so. And if you want to find out anything to do with what I'm doing, go and visit thehumandiver.com. And there is also a Facebook group, and recommend self-publication. I'm rubbish at publicizing myself. Go and Google Under Pressure as a book. It is full of stuff all about this sort of material, how to make your dives better, how to make them safer, how to make your instruction more effective, and generally just having a good time. Paul, will you debrief Mark after this? And but he's already done that, but we would have a wash up after this. So yes, definitely. Thanks, Graham, for posting the link to Laura's site. And Mark Rowe, how do you think that went? Is a great open-ended question. The downside of that is, and having been on the end of Mark's debriefs, often we put ourselves down massively when we're in an environment. And maybe that's a British thing, that we don't like to big ourselves up. It's a great opening piece, but having a structure like debrief or something similar that allows you to step through team learning, I think is more beneficial. So thanks so much, everybody. Excellent. Brittany, I don't know what you need to do to close this down. Thanks very much.